Scientology could be called, well, you could call it a religion of religions.
Okay, let's continue with what we started talking about in the last interview, and what you said something that was really, really interesting, because I've always sort of wondered about this, because David Mayo seemed to sort of distance himself a bit from Scientology, and you said last interview that Mayo renounced the tech.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate and be specific? Like, do you mean that he, like, because I've heard that he suggested that OT3 could be entirely false, but are you saying that, like, across the board, a lot of it he thinks is bullshit, or what?
Yeah, the whole thing. I hadn't spoken with him for years because in 1996 I decided I'd had enough of being steamrolled by Scientology, and so I stopped writing about it. And in 2013 I came back because I realized that many people just don't recover. They could spend decades afterwards still caught up and entangled in all of these ideas, not able to find a way out of them. It's much more elaborate than any other belief system that I've encountered, and I've studied a lot of belief systems. So in 2013, when David heard that I was back on the scene, he contacted me and said he wanted to talk. And we talked for 3 hours. And it was a remarkable conversation because, to tell you the truth, I met David first in 1986. Well, I've gone all blurry. And
it was an apparition.
Yes, incredible. I was around him.
It's the BTs. They're trying to interfere with you because you're going into some deep stuff. It's the worst. Special affairs. It's someone trying to qualify for OT8 and they're trying to interfere.
Yeah, and let's face it, if they really had any chops, they'd have erased me by now, making my picture go fuzzy. That's nothing. Even I can do that. When I met him, I first met him in September '86 in Palo Alto when he was at the Advanced Ability Center. We'd been in touch, but I met him, I interviewed him. I was there for a couple of weeks, then I went to LA and I came back for a couple of weeks. I was back there and spent time with him in '88, and I didn't like him. Plain and simple. I get on with almost anybody. Well, that was what I worked out in 2013, that the man I talked to in 2013, I got on with very well. And I realized it was something incredibly simple. When he was put through the running program, running around a pole in the desert at 100 degrees Fahrenheit.
AKA cause resurgence.
Yeah. He lost all of his teeth as a consequence of the dehydration. And so when I met him, he was having very painful dental surgery and he didn't smile. And it was that simple, and he seemed very cold. And when I talked to him in 2013, I realized that he's actually a very decent, compassionate sort of man. Which, hadn't got close to him. So he told me that basically he'd done some psychology courses, and when he was working, when I first went to the Advanced Ability Center in '86, Frank Sarge-Gabodi was running it. He's quite interesting because of course he was a fully qualified psychiatrist who then became involved in Scientology. And I think he's unique. I don't think there's anybody else that you could say that about. And he was a research psychiatrist, qualified at Stanford, Cambridge in the UK, where he did his master's and then did a doctorate at Stanford. And his childhood friend, Gary French, got him involved. And he set up a mission, he ran a mission, and then they defected, as did so many of the missions during the early 1980s, because of the pressure that was put upon them by Hubbard through the Commodore's Messenger organization. And they ran an independent center, and this was called the Advanced Ability Center because it was affiliated with David Mayo's center in Santa Barbara. Then David moved there, and Sarge paid him quite well. And everybody wanted to go there. I mean, I remember meeting the physicist Hal Puthoff's wife was there when I went there. And Hal Puthoff ran the Stanford Research Institute things with Uri Geller. the remote viewing things, which were a huge sensation in the 70s. And later, when Hal was trying to say publicly that he'd never really been that involved with Scientology, I pointed out he'd done OT3. And when I met his wife, she was doing OT5. So I think they were pretty involved. But
so Hal's wife was an independent.
yes, I think Hal himself by that time had decided he didn't want to do any more. He was a professor at the Texas University, which is one of the significant places for the study of physics, alongside probably MIT in the US. So anyway, there were a lot of people there, and they all wanted to meet David, and David was a great star. And the thing I did like about him was that he quite obviously he cringed at the adulation. He really didn't like it, and that I did admire. But we spent time together, and they were still giving advanced ability level 3, as they called it, OT3. And I was long out of Scientology. I left completely in '84. And I pleaded with them to stop doing two things: the OT levels, because I'd seen the damage. We talked about that in our last conversation. I'd seen people going psychotic doing this material. I'd seen people's lives ruined by trying to find body thetans, and it's madness. It's absolutely in contradiction to the auditor's code, which says you never evaluate for the pre-clear. Telling them the date of the incident, the content of the incident, it's just wrong. It goes against everything. If OT3 is real, people will find it on their own, the wall of fire. But I'd seen the damage it did, and I pleaded with Sarge Gabodi and David Mayo to stop doing it. When I went back in that in the purification rundown, because I was aware of deaths on the purification rundown. There were 2 deaths in East Grinstead when the rundown was first released. I'd seen a guy who was a black belt in Taekwondo and karate, a very sharp guy, who had come back from doing the purification rundown in Florida. He was in a wheelchair and he could barely form a sentence anymore. So, these massive doses of vitamins, and of course it was run at too high a temperature for the first 6 months. So people got, they got brain damage doing it.
Yeah, I think it's probably too hot, and certainly too much vitamins, because you actually feel sick when you get up to the high amount, and the sick is your body saying, I don't want this. Your body's saying this is just too much. Like, I agree, maybe you need to take a bunch of vitamins, but it's like there's a point where it's just ridiculous, and your body's actually going, this is disgusting. I can't handle all these vitamins. It's insane, really. It's so much vitamins. It's crazy.
Yes, and they're vitamins because a deficiency of one of them will give you a syndrome. So scurvy for vitamin C, for example, you don't need them for anything else. So taking huge quantities of them, what happens is with the water-based ones like vitamin C, that if you take 10 grams of vitamin C a day, your body will be excreting that vitamin C. You can measure it in the urine. It's just being peed out.
Yeah, just being pissed out. Yeah.
And then if you stop taking it, you'll get the deficiency syndrome because your body's got used to getting rid of it. So you'll feel worse.
And when because I've been, involved with saunas and stuff. And when your body craves something, like I had it with like fruit juice or something, the body would be like, oh, I want fruit juice or whatever. And I'll go and get fruit juice and it'll be like the best thing ever. When your body craves it, you don't feel repulsed when you're taking it. You're like, like when you're in a desert and you've got water, you're like, oh, you gobble it down. So with the vitamins, the reaction that people are getting, like, it's just your body's not craving it. If it was craving the vitamins, and you'll be like, oh, vitamin D, vitamin C, you know what I mean? You're gobbling it down.
Yeah. When we did the Toronto Getting Clear conference in 2015, which is all up online on Vimeo for, like $3 Australian a lecture or something. There was an astonishing woman, the Professor Jim Beverly, who helped me put it together, found this woman who was a toxicologist, Angela Harris, and she did a deconstruction of the purification rundown based upon the bulletins. And she just went through it line by line and said, well, as he says here, this is a supposition, it's not proved. As he says here, there is no evidence for this. And they didn't bother to find any evidence. And it shows you exactly Hubbard's research path, which is, I've had a thought, it's therefore true. Not 1,000 cases in a gold standard study, then replicated by separate people. But I think this is a good idea.
Yeah, and LSD's water-based and apparently doesn't
Yep.
stay in the body. And from my looking
Can't.
into it, the flashback isn't because it's getting re-released in the body. The flashback relates to like LSD, I think, opens up some part of the mind, and then that can get opened up again. But it's not because you got the LSD chemical in you, because I've heard
It's not storable.
sometimes people can have a flashback when they're lying in the sun, and something to do with the sun waking up the part of the brain, like the pineal or something. And
Well,
and they mix LSD with water or something like that. So it's like, it just, I don't know, it doesn't quite hold water. Yeah.
no, nothing that's water soluble can be retained by the human body. So that was nonsense. Let me tell you
Yeah,
something
but
else.
also they can't test. Can they even test that somebody's even had LSD like a month later? They can't. They can only test it within 3-day period or something, because it goes out of the body.
Yeah, you might be able to test metabolites in the hair. You might be. I don't know. I know you can with cannabis and with cocaine. I don't really know with LSD, but you can't test the substance itself. It's gone. I talked with a doctor who was the doctor for the purification rundown when it was first run at St. Hill, which is why I'm confident that 2 people died, because he told me they had. And I tracked one of them down. I found that this guy had been found. He'd fallen off his bicycle and just dropped dead in East Grinstead, a guy in his 40s. And talking to this doctor, I said, I've come to the point of view, and this doctor was a nutritional doctor, so he's an expert on vitamins and medicines. I've come to the point of view that it's probably something in the vitamins that's causing the trip. And I said, I think it's the B vitamins. And he just looked straight at me and said, it's vitamin B1.
What do you
High
mean
doses of
trip? What trip do you mean?
an acid trip, an LSD experience, what you're calling a flashback.
Oh, in the sauna, someone having
vitamin B1 taken in large doses can cause hallucinations, and the doses on the purification rundown certainly qualify.
Oh wow, yeah, because I had a friend who I remember, he said he'd done LSD once or something, and then he did his purif, and it took him like 100 days. But he wasn't a heavy drug case at all, but he'd taken a while, and I think he said it was because of LSD, and I kind of thought, what, he must have been getting reactions or something to make him think he needed to keep on going into the sauna.
And bear in mind that Hubbard had the psychiatric drug Vistaril in his body at autopsy, so he wasn't against the use of drugs personally. That this was just something he sold to us.
Yeah, and he wasn't pro personally. He wasn't pro detoxing, because he had all these chemicals in him, and he didn't give a shit about his body.
No, and there's no evidence that he ever did the purification rundown. He was too fat and lazy for that.
Well, yeah. I don't think he would have followed the rules of it and stuff. So we were talking about this Mayo stuff.
Which I got to OT3, and I was saying that I said, I pleaded with them to stop doing it because it's crazy nonsense, and it telling somebody that they're split into thousands of little beings, it's not very helpful.
And also for people who are listening, for someone who's not involved in Scientology, hearing that it doesn't have quite an effect, but when I think you've had the years of the brainwashing and you really respect what Hubbard says, then it really has an influence, hearing that sort of stuff. It's different, you can't understand unless, in your world, you're really into Hubbard and stuff like that. And like when he says you can get the side effect of the OT levels, someone on the street can say that doesn't mean anything, but when you hear it from Hubbard, it's like, this is fact, and that really gets into people's minds.
Yeah, he is considered to be the wisest man who ever lived by Scientologists, and yes, he's believed it. You're exactly right. I'd been in Scientology for 7 years before I did OT3, and it's increments of dissonance that we, baby steps, we buy into a little bit, and then we go a little bit further. And 7 years later, I sat down and I read the OT3 pack, and I still looked at it and went, this is weird. I didn't go, oh wow, fantastic revelation. I mean, I'd looked at the book Scientology: History of Man and thought, well, he was having a bad week that week. I'd never, because it wasn't on any of the courses I did. So I thought, well, he just had some silly ideas about, we're all descended from clams, for example, and the Piltdown Man, which he seemed to, it's still in the book. It's been exposed as a fraud since the 1950s, but it's still in that book. that they're this ancestor of man. So when I went back in '88, they'd stopped giving OT3, and they now were doing traumatic incident reduction, or Dianetics, as we used to call it. And they'd pretty much thrown everything else away. And the Institute for Research into Metapsychology, which is what Sarge's lot came to be called. And my single claim to fame is that I gave him the word metapsychology because he was looking for something to call the Institute. And Sarge, because he'd been a psychiatrist, had all of the works of Freud in his life, just this huge row of books. And he probably read them as well. I pulled one of them out, and there was this word metapsychology. And I said, Sarge, why don't you call it metapsychology? It's like, and away we went. But they'd stopped doing that.
Was that because of when you sat down and spoke with Mayo and you suggested that OT3 is bullshit? Is that what led on to encouraged him to go on to get rid of all that stuff, or?
I don't think so. They were adamant they were going to keep on doing it. I think it, I was one of the people that said something, and Sarge Gabodi is an incredibly highly educated and clever human being, and I think they just basically they'd stripped away the grades, they'd stripped away the objective processes, and all they were left with was Dianetics, and they used a form of R3R, routine 3 revised, the later form of Dianetics, new era Dianetics, as it was called, which is from 77, 78. Moved to the beginning of the incident, tell me when you're there, all of that good stuff. And that's what the Institute for Research into Metapsychology have carried on doing, traumatic incident reduction.
And was that the group that Mayo was involved with?
Yes, he's one of the founders of that group when his advanced ability centers move over and become that. So in 2013, when we talked, we had a lot of catching up to do, and he told me, I didn't, if I'm into, there's a situation where, now I couldn't care less, and I'll just tell you exactly what I feel, okay? It's just the way it's become. But while I was still concerned to gather people's information and evidence, I wouldn't contradict them. I'd let them tell me the whole story. It's like I had a guy who spent 3 nights, Brian Rubinek, trying to persuade me that Ron Hubbard didn't know about the break-ins. And on the end of the 3rd night, and he'd been Hubbard's bodyguard on the ship, he was the guy that ran Michael Meisner doing the break-ins, so he claimed, and all of that. So the end I didn't contradict him. I heard everything he had to say. I'm not here to fight with people. I wasn't. I was a historian from my perspective. At the end of it, I said, well, I've actually been told by Ken Urquhart, who since has said he didn't tell me this, but that he'd overheard Ron Hubbard asking Mary Sue Hubbard, how are the break-ins in Washington going? So with David Mayo, he told me a story that I couldn't make any sense of. He said in 1968, when OT3 was released, he was sent from the Sea Org with Captain Bill Robertson, to Edinburgh to start the Hubbard Association of Personal Integrity, or HAPPY, in Edinburgh. And this is where OT3 was first released. You can find an astonishing account of it in Robert Kaufman's book, Inside Scientology, or How I Became Superman.
You mean AO Edinburgh, right?
It was called HAPPY, but yes, it was the first advanced organization, yeah. It wasn't very happy, it was very unhappy. A man called James Stewart ended up jumping out of a hotel window as a consequence of his treatment there. He was an epileptic and he was ordered not to have any more fits. And I'm afraid he didn't have control over that. So Captain Bill himself told me that he'd forced him as a punishment to crawl across a slate roof, and they're very steeply pitched, 3 stories high in the rain, a slippery, and Kaufman cracked. Sorry, not Kaufman, Stewart cracked and killed himself. And so Scientology, of course, then tidied up the room before the police were told. And the media were told, oh, he was just a beginner. He'd not had much to do with Scientology. He was the head of the Durban organization. He'd been in Scientology for years. So they're liars, but sanity, honesty is sanity. Let's remember that Ron Hubbard said honesty is sanity here. And you can tell as many shore stories as you want if it protects Ron from prosecution. So David told me that as soon as he opened the the OT3 pack, he realized that Hubbard was mad. This is 1968. And from then on, his whole concern was to get people out of Scientology. And he told me that he'd got 2,000 people out. I didn't know what to say, because I remembered in 1986 pleading with him to stop selling OT3 to people.
Yeah, that really doesn't make sense, because when he started his or maybe he had to run his independent AAC or whatever for a few years and give people the impression that he's actually delivering the tech, so then more people want to leave, and then he can change. Because if he straight away started squirreling, then people wouldn't leave the church.
No, I think David was the most honorable and ethical man. And I think that what we're looking at is what's called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. This is a psychological mechanism which is well recorded, that one of the examples is what's called the Challenger study. When the Challenger blew up and meant that L. Ron Hubbard didn't make the front page of the newspapers because his death wasn't announced in time. There was a professor who sat his students down and had them write down, where they were and what they thought at the time that it happened. And I think 2 years later, he asked them to come back and write the account again. And I think only 1 in 10 of them wrote the same account, 90% of them. And the famous one is the guy who looked at his own handwritten account from 2 years before and said, "That's my handwriting, but that's not what happened." Now, that is called the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. And it is seen again and again that if you take contemporary records, something that, a person wrote at the time, and you come back 10 or 15 years later, their account of it will be different. That's normal. Hubbard says it too. He says that when you have become clear, you'll forget what it was like not to be clear. And David, as I say, I think he was the most honorable of men, but he couldn't believe that he did believe. And maybe, we'll come back and have an interview in 10 years' time, and we'll see how much you remember of what we said tonight. Well, we talked about Walt Disney, I think, didn't we? And the influence he had upon people's minds through OT3. So David told me this thing that he never believed OT3. He then talked about all that was left after his work with Sarge Gabodi was traumatic incident reduction. And he told me that the more he'd looked into that and the more he'd done it, and I don't think anybody did more of it than David, the more he came to realize that it couldn't possibly work. And that people weren't really getting better. They were just getting addicted. Just as Freud had said when he originally denounced the Dianetic technique in 1911, I think it was, when he explained that it doesn't help people reduce the transference. It doesn't help people become less dependent. It does the opposite. And this is certainly, I'm pretty sure, what Hubbard read that gave him Dianetics. This one lecture where Yusuf Breuer's technique of going back into the memory is used. And he went, "Oh, makes people more dependent. That's a good idea." And it does. People make no progress whatsoever. Their marriages fall apart. They stop talking to their children. They go bankrupt. They betray their friends in knowledge reports. They do all sorts of hideous, unethical things because they are grasping for that sense of the win, being in the win, the euphoria, the high of the very good indicators, just like any junkie. And so, the forgettingness curve, people change their stories. And David, while I cannot believe what he said about OT3 and, trying to get people out of Scientology, that just doesn't make any sense to me. I do believe he was honorable. And I did study his life in some detail to create an account of Scientology. And he came to the sincere belief that Scientology was not helpful in any way. In fact, quite the opposite. It's a way of enslaving people.
He really came to that belief. He really renounced the tech.
Yes, completely.
Yeah, I think that makes sense if you look at how he just sort of stopped talking about Scientology and got into the psychology stuff. And then I remember when he passed away, looking at his like website and stuff like that, and it didn't even mention Scientology. It almost was like he said, "No, I'm separating from this. I'm not going to be involved with it."